There's a certain kind of peace that comes with living in the suburbs. The neatly trimmed lawns, the cookie-cutter houses, the occasional neighbor who waves at you like they actually care about your existence. It's all very American dream. That's what I thought when I moved to Willow Creek Estates, a neighborhood that prides itself on being the pinnacle of suburban excellence. Little did I know, this place had a dark side. And by dark side, I mean the HOA, Homeowners Association, a group of people who apparently believe they're running a small dictatorship instead of a neighborhood. It all started on a Tuesday morning. I remember it vividly because it was one of those rare days when everything seemed to be going right. My coffee wasn't burnt. My shirt didn't have a mysterious stain, and my son Ethan actually smiled at me before heading out the door for school. Ethan's 12 years old and has been through more than most adults I know. He was born with a congenital heart defect, and after years of surgeries and hospital visits, he now relies on an artificial heart, a device that literally keeps him alive every single day. It's not just a piece of equipment, it's his lifeline. So there I was, sipping my coffee and enjoying the calm before the storm. And then I saw it, the storm itself, right outside my front door. Ethan's backpack was lying on the ground, torn open like it had been mauled by a pack of wild dogs. At first, I thought maybe some raccoon had gotten into it or that Ethan had accidentally dropped it and run off to catch the bus. But then I saw the HOA notice pinned to the shredded fabric. The notice was written in that condescending tone only HOA letters can manage. Dear Mr. Jack Carter, your property is in violation of Section 4B(2) of the Willow Creek Estates Aesthetic Guidelines. The presence of an unsightly backpack on your front porch is unacceptable and detracts from the visual harmony of our community. Please remove said item immediately or face further penalties. Unsightly? Unsightly? It was a backpack, not a pile of garbage or an abandoned car. And worse, it wasn't just any backpack. It was Ethan's medical bag, specifically designed to carry his artificial heart and its accompanying equipment safely. Without it, Ethan couldn't go to school, couldn't leave the house, he couldn't live. I stared at the notice in disbelief for what felt like an eternity before my brain finally caught up with reality. Someone from the HOA had actually come onto my property, ripped apart my son's medical bag, and left this passive-aggressive note as if they were doing me a favor. My first thought was, this has to be illegal. My second thought was, Linda. Linda is the president of our HOA, a woman who takes her role far too seriously. She's the kind of person who sends out emails reminding everyone to mow their lawns exactly every 7 days and who once fined a neighbor for having an unapproved shade of beige on their garage door. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone with too much time on their hands gets a little bit of power, well, Linda happens. I grabbed the shredded backpack and stormed back inside, muttering every curse word I could think of under my breath. Ethan hadn't left for school yet. Thank God. And when he saw me holding his ruined bag, his face fell faster than my faith in humanity. What happened? He asked quietly. The HO, I said through gritted teeth. Ethan didn't say anything else. He just looked at me with those big brown eyes that always made me feel like I had to fix everything, no matter how impossible it seemed. So that's what I did, or at least tried to do. First, I called Linda directly because honestly, who has time for formalities when your kid's life is literally at stake? Hello, Linda answered in her usual chipper but fake voice. Linda, I said, trying to keep my tone civil even though every fiber of my being wanted to yell at her. Did you, or someone from the HOA, destroy my son's backpack? Oh, she said lightly, as if we were discussing the weather instead of blatant property destruction. Yes, Jack. That backpack was left out in plain view on your porch for hours yesterday evening. It didn't comply with our neighborhood guidelines. It's not just a backpack, I snapped. It's a medical device carrier for my son's artificial heart. There was silence on her end for a moment, just long enough for me to hope she might actually feel some semblance of remorse. But then she said, well, Jack, rules are rules. Rules are rules. That was her response. As if this whole situation was about something trivial like parking violations or overgrown hedges. My blood pressure skyrocketed so fast I'm pretty sure my own heart skipped a beat. Linda, I said slowly, trying not to lose it completely, You destroyed something vital to my son's health. Well, she replied breezily, perhaps you should have stored it somewhere less visible. Less visible? What did she expect me to do? Bury it in the backyard? Hide it in the attic? This wasn't some decorative lawn ornament. This was equipment keeping my child alive. I hung up before I could say something that would get me arrested or worse, fined by the HOA again. But trust me when I say this, war had officially been declared. The rest of the morning was spent frantically trying to find a replacement bag for Ethan, while also calling his doctor to make sure there weren't any immediate risks from having his equipment exposed like that overnight. Thankfully, we managed to get everything sorted out before school started, but not without some serious stress and tears along the way. As Ethan finally headed off to class with his new, and very expensive, medical bag in tow, I stood there on my porch staring at that ridiculous HOA notice again. This wasn't just about aesthetics or guidelines anymore. This was personal. And let me tell you something about Jack Carter. When you mess with his kid, you mess with him. So, there I was, standing on my porch with a crumpled HOA notice in one hand and a shredded medical bag in the other, trying to figure out what kind of alternate reality I'd stumbled into. I mean, I knew the HOA had a reputation for being strict, but this was next-level insanity. And if you think I was just going to let it slide, well, you clearly don't know me. The first thing I did was try to reason with them because, I'm a reasonable guy. I sent an email to the HOA board explaining the situation in painstaking detail. I even attached pictures of the torn bag and Ethan's medical equipment, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd realize they'd made a mistake and apologize. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Instead, I got a reply from Linda herself. It was short, curt, and oozing with that special brand of passive-aggressiveness that only HOA presidents seem to master. Dear Mr. Carter, it began, thank you for your email. While we sympathize with your situation, we must remind you that all residents are expected to adhere to the community guidelines outlined in the Willow Creek Estates Handbook. Exceptions cannot be made for individual circumstances, as this would undermine the integrity of our neighborhood standards. Integrity? Neighborhood standards? They tore apart my son's medical bag like it was an old gym sock, and now they wanted to talk about integrity? It was at this point that I realized reasoning with these people was like trying to teach algebra to a goldfish. Completely pointless. But fine. If they wanted to play hardball, so could I. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to confront Linda and the rest of her minions in person. Now, if you've never been to an HOA meeting before, let me paint you a picture. It's basically a room full of people who have way too much time on their hands arguing over things like mailbox colors and whether or not garden gnomes should be allowed. It's like a soap opera, but somehow even pettier. When I walked into that meeting, all eyes turned to me. Linda was sitting at the head of the table with her perfectly coiffed hair and her clipboard of doom, looking like she'd just won an award for most annoying person alive. She gave me one of those fake smiles that said, "Oh great, here comes trouble. Jack," she said sweetly as I took a seat. "What brings you here tonight?" "Oh, I replied casually. "Just wanted to talk about how your little guidelines nearly killed my son." That got their attention. The room went dead silent as everyone turned to look at Linda, who suddenly seemed very interested in her clipboard. "I'm sorry," she said after a long pause. "I don't understand what you mean." "Really?" I said, holding up the shredded remains of Ethan's bag like it was Exhibit A in a murder trial. "You don't understand how destroying this might have put my son's life at risk? Because it sure seems pretty straightforward to me." Linda opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by one of her lackeys, a guy named Bob who looked like he spent more time polishing his lawn mower than talking to his own family. "Well," Bob said nervously, "the guidelines are very clear about keeping personal items out of sight." "Personal items?" I shot back. "This isn't a pair of dirty sneakers or an old bicycle. This is medical equipment. Do you people even hear yourselves?" At this point, another board member, a woman named Karen, of course, chimed in with what she probably thought was a helpful suggestion. "Maybe you could store it in your garage?" I stared at her in disbelief. "Store it in my garage? You want me to put my son's life-saving equipment next to my lawnmower and a can of WD-40? Are you serious?" Karen shrugged like she didn't see the problem, And that's when I realized these people weren't just clueless, they were dangerous. The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with half the room arguing about whether or not medical bags counted as unsightly, and the other half trying to change the subject back to something less controversial, like whether or not Christmas lights should be taken down by January 15th or January 31st. By the end of it all, nothing had been resolved except for one thing. My hatred for Linda and her merry band of rule enforcers had reached new heights. But here's where things really took a turn for the worse. A few days after the meeting, I got another notice from the HOA, this time informing me that I'd been fined $500 for disrupting community harmony at the meeting. Disrupting community harmony? Are you kidding me? All I did was point out that they'd endangered my son's life. If anything was disrupting community harmony, it was their complete lack of common sense. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they also threatened to escalate things further if I didn't comply with their guidelines moving forward. That's right, they actually had the audacity to double down on their nonsense instead of admitting they were wrong. At this point, most people probably would have thrown in the towel and started packing their bags. But not me. Oh no. If Linda and her cronies thought they could bully me into submission, they were sorely mistaken. I started doing some digging, reading through every page of that ridiculous HOA handbook and researching state laws about homeowners associations. Did you know there are actual legal limits on what HOAs can enforce? Because apparently Linda didn't. And let me tell you, finding those loopholes felt like striking gold. I also started talking to my neighbors, many of whom had their own horror stories about run-ins with the HOA. One guy told me he'd been fined for having his trash cans out 5 minutes before pickup time. Another woman said she'd been forced to repaint her front door because it wasn't an approved shade of beige. Sound familiar? It turns out Linda had been running this place like her own personal fiefdom for years, and most people were too scared or too tired to fight back. Well, not anymore. By the time I was done gathering evidence and rallying support from my neighbors, I had everything I needed to take on Linda and her little dictatorship once and for all. But that's a story for another day. You know that moment in every revenge movie where the hero finally snaps, throws on a leather jacket, and starts plotting their epic takedown? Yeah, that was me minus the leather jacket. I don't own one, but metaphorically speaking, I was ready to go full Liam Neeson in taking on Linda and her HOA goons. They had messed with the wrong dad. After the ridiculous $500 fine for disrupting community harmony, I decided it was time to take things up a notch. No more emails, no more polite conversations. This was war. And like any good general preparing for battle, I needed a strategy. Step 1. Gather evidence. I spent hours combing through the HOA handbook, which, by the way, is about as thrilling to read as a tax code. But buried in all that legalese were some interesting tidbits. For example, did you know that HOAs are required to follow state laws about reasonable accommodations for medical needs? Yeah, neither did Linda, apparently. And then there was the part about how HOA board members are supposed to act in good faith and in the best interest of the community. I'm no lawyer, but tearing apart a kid's medical bag doesn't exactly scream good faith, does it? But the real goldmine came when I started talking to my neighbors. Turns out, everyone had a Linda story. There was Greg from down the street, who got fined $200 because his mailbox wasn't regulation height. Then there was Susan, who had to repaint her front door twice because it wasn't an approved shade of beige. Seriously? What is Linda's obsession with beige? And let's not forget poor Mr. Thompson, who got a cease and desist letter for planting sunflowers in his front yard because they were too tall. Too tall? They're flowers, not skyscrapers. The more stories I heard, the angrier I got, and not just for myself. This wasn't just about Ethan's backpack anymore. This was about an entire neighborhood being held hostage by one woman's power trip. It was time to take her down. Step 2, lawyer up. Now, I don't know if you've ever had to hire a lawyer before, but let me tell you, it's like shopping for a car. You want someone who's tough but not too expensive, knowledgeable but not condescending. After a few consultations and a lot of Googling, I found my guy, Dan Miller, attorney at law. Dan was everything I needed, sharp, no nonsense, and with just enough of a sarcastic edge to make me feel like he actually enjoyed sticking it to people like Linda. When I told Dan my story, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said, "this is something." Something good or something bad? I asked. Oh, it's good, he said with a grin. For us. Dan explained that we had a pretty solid case against the HOA, especially since they'd destroyed Ethan's medical bag without any kind of due process. Apparently, there are actual laws about this kind of thing. Who knew? And Linda had violated pretty much all of them. Step 3, hit them where it hurts, their wallets. Dan filed a lawsuit against the HOA on my behalf, claiming damages for property destruction, emotional distress. Because let's be real, this whole ordeal had been very distressing, and failure to accommodate Ethan's medical needs. We also demanded that they cover the cost of replacing Ethan's bag and equipment, which wasn't cheap, and waive all those ridiculous fines they'd slapped on me. Now here's where things get interesting. Once word got out about the lawsuit, my neighbors started coming out of the woodwork with their own complaints about Linda and the HOA. It was like opening Pandora's box. But instead of unleashing plagues and curses, we unleashed an avalanche of petty grievances and pent-up frustration. Greg wanted to know if he could join the lawsuit over his mailbox fine. Susan asked if she could sue for emotional damages from having to repaint her door 3 times. She'd finally settled on beige. Even Mr. Thompson showed up at my door with a folder full of documents proving that sunflowers were not against HOA guidelines. It was beautiful, a full-blown neighborhood rebellion against Linda and her reign of terror. Of course, Linda didn't take this lying down. She called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she referred to as the growing unrest in our community. Translation: she was freaking out because she realized she might actually lose control. I decided to attend this meeting, not because I thought anything productive would come of it, but because I wanted to see Linda squirm in person. The meeting started off as expected. Linda gave a long-winded speech about community values and how important it was for everyone to follow the rules, blah blah blah. But then Greg stood up and asked why his mailbox height mattered more than his ability to receive mail without bending over like Quasimodo. And then Susan chimed in with a question about why beige was considered superior to other colors, like blue or green or literally anything else. By the time Mr. Thompson got up to talk about his sunflowers, they're native plants. They attract pollinators. Linda looked like she was ready to implode. And then it happened, the moment we'd all been waiting for. One brave soul, I think it was Karen from 2 streets over, stood up and asked point-blank, "Linda, what gives you the right to make these decisions? Who put you in charge?" The room erupted into chaos after that. People shouting over each other, demanding answers, waving their HOA handbooks around like they were sacred texts. It was glorious. But here's the best part. During all this commotion, someone mentioned that they'd seen Linda using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, like landscaping her backyard and installing a fancy new security system at her house. At first, I thought it might just be a rumor. But then Greg pulled out his phone and showed us an email chain where Linda had literally approved these expenses herself. It was like watching a house of cards come crashing down in real time. By the end of the meeting, half the room was calling for Linda's resignation, while the other half was demanding an audit of the HOA's finances. As for me, well, let's just say I walked out of there feeling pretty damn good about my chances in court. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet. It's absolutely hilarious. If the last HOA meeting was a dumpster fire, then what came next was a full-blown inferno. After the accusations of Linda misusing HOA funds started flying around, things escalated faster than a toddler on a sugar high. Suddenly, everyone in the neighborhood wanted answers, and not just about mailbox heights or beige paint. Oh no, this was bigger. This was about accountability, justice, and, most importantly, revenge. Now, I'd love to tell you that Linda immediately confessed to everything and resigned in shame, but come on, this is Linda we're talking about. Instead of owning up to her actions, she doubled down. She sent out an email to the entire neighborhood claiming that the allegations against her were baseless and an attack on the integrity of Willow Creek Estates. Integrity, from the woman who once fined someone for having a flamingo lawn ornament that was too whimsical. You can't make this stuff up. But here's the thing about lies. They have a funny way of unraveling when you start pulling at the threads. And boy, did we pull. It all started with Greg. You remember Greg, right? The guy with the mailbox? Turns out Greg works in accounting, And he's one of those people who actually enjoys spreadsheets. I know, weird. Anyway, Greg decided to take a closer look at the HOA's financial records, which, thanks to some obscure state law, are technically supposed to be available to all residents upon request. Linda had been conveniently forgetting this little detail for years, but Greg wasn't about to let her get away with it. Armed with nothing but his laptop and an unhealthy amount of caffeine, Greg spent an entire weekend combing through every transaction in the HOA's budget. And let me tell you, what he found was chef's kiss perfection. First off, there were the landscaping expenses, thousands of dollars spent on community beautification projects that just so happened to include Linda's backyard. Then there were the security upgrades. Cameras, motion sensors, even a fancy new gate for her driveway, all paid for with HOA funds. But the piece de resistance? A $1,200 charge for office supplies that turned out to be, wait for it, a Peloton bike. A Peloton bike for office supplies. I mean, I've heard of creative accounting before, but this was next level. Once Greg shared his findings with the rest of us, it was game over for Linda. People were furious, not just because she'd been stealing from us, but because she'd been doing it so blatantly. It was like she didn't even care if she got caught. And honestly, that made it all the more satisfying when she finally did. But wait, it gets better. While Greg was busy playing forensic accountant, another neighbor, Susan, the one with the beige door, decided to dig into Linda's emails. Now, before you start wondering how Susan got access to Linda's emails, let me just say this. Never underestimate the power of a bored suburban mom with too much time on her hands. Let's just say Susan had connections. And leave it at that. Anyway, what Susan found was even juicier than Greg's spreadsheet. There were emails between Linda and other board members where she openly admitted to bending the rules for her own benefit. In one particularly damning exchange, she wrote, "I know technically we're supposed to get approval from the board before making big purchases, but let's be real. What they don't know won't hurt them." Yeah, that didn't age well. But my personal favorite email was one where Linda complained about how ungrateful everyone in the neighborhood was. She actually wrote, "I do so much for this community, and all they do is whine about their stupid mailboxes and ugly front doors. Sometimes I think they don't deserve me." Deserve her? Lady, we didn't ask for you. Armed with all this evidence, the financial records from Greg and the emails from Susan, we decided it was time to take things to the next level. Dan, my lawyer, helped us file an official complaint with the State Attorney General's office, alleging embezzlement and abuse of power. We also called for an emergency vote to remove Linda from her position as HOA president. The vote took place at yet another HOA meeting, because apparently these things are like cockroaches. They just keep coming back no matter how much you try to get rid of them. This time, though, it wasn't just me and a handful of disgruntled neighbors. It was practically the entire neighborhood. People who hadn't shown up to an HOA meeting in years came out of the woodwork just to see Linda get what was coming to her. And let me tell you, it did not disappoint. Linda showed up looking like she'd just walked off the set of Real Housewives, complete with oversized sunglasses and a designer handbag that we all knew had probably been paid for with our HOA dues. She tried to defend herself, talked about how everything she'd done was for the good of the community, and how we were all being unfairly critical. But no one was buying it. When it came time for the vote, it wasn't even close. 92% voted to remove her from office immediately. The remaining 8%, probably just people who hit the wrong button on their ballots. As Linda stormed out of the meeting in a huff, and yes, there was literal huffing involved, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Not just for myself or Ethan, but for everyone in Willow Creek Estates who'd been living under her tyrannical rule for so long. But here's where things really got satisfying. After Linda was ousted as president, we discovered even more dirt on her, including evidence that she'd been pocketing money from HOA fines for years. Long story short, she ended up facing criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Last I heard, she's still trying to fight them in court. But honestly, that's not my problem anymore. As for me and Ethan, well, let's just say life has been a lot quieter since Linda left. No more ridiculous fines or passive-aggressive notices. No more worrying about whether his medical bag violates some arbitrary rule. For once, it feels like we can actually breathe again, And isn't that what living in suburbia is supposed to be about? So yeah, maybe revenge isn't always sweet, but sometimes it's downright hilarious. So Linda was gone, banished, ousted, removed from her suburban throne like the tyrant she was. And let me tell you, the air in Willow Creek Estates had never smelled sweeter. It was like someone had opened all the windows after years of living under the suffocating stench of HOA oppression. People were smiling at each other on the streets again. Kids were riding bikes without fear of getting fined for unauthorized wheel activity. It was beautiful. But, of course, the story didn't end there. Oh no, because what's a good revenge story without a little epilogue to tie everything up in a neat, satisfying bow? First things first, the lawsuit. Remember that? The one I filed against the HOA for destroying Ethan's medical bag and, nearly killing my kid? Well, after Linda's removal, the new board, led by Greg, yes, Greg with the mailbox, decided to settle out of court. They agreed to cover all of Ethan's medical expenses, replace his equipment, and pay for a shiny new medical bag that was so high-tech it looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Oh, and they also waived every single fine I'd ever received under Linda's reign of terror. It was like Christmas came early. But the best part? The HOA had to issue a formal apology, not just to me but to the entire neighborhood, for everything Linda had done. And when I say formal apology, I mean they had to print it in bold letters on the front page of their monthly newsletter. You better believe I framed that thing and hung it in my living room. Now let's talk about Linda for a second. After she was removed from her position and hit with criminal charges for embezzlement, she kind of disappeared. Rumor has it she moved to Florida, because of course she did, where she's probably terrorizing some poor retirement community with her rules are rules nonsense. Honestly, good riddance. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek Estates, things started to change. And for the better. Greg and the new HOA board actually listened to people's concerns instead of dismissing them as whining. They revised the community guidelines to make them less ridiculous. Goodbye, beige-only doors. And focused on things that actually mattered, like fixing potholes and organizing neighborhood events that didn't involve passive-aggressive PowerPoint presentations. And speaking of events, let me tell you about the first post-Linda HOA meeting. It was glorious. Instead of sitting through an hour-long lecture about how we were all failing as homeowners, we actually got stuff done. And we had snacks. Real snacks. Not those sad little store-brand cookies Linda used to bring, but actual homemade brownies courtesy of Susan, who finally painted her door blue. By the way, it was like stepping into an alternate universe where HOAs weren't run by power-hungry maniacs. As for me and Ethan, life went back to normal, or as normal as life can be when you've just taken down a suburban dictator. Ethan started middle school with his new medical bag in tow, and he's doing great. He even joined the school robotics club and built a little robot that delivers snacks, because apparently saving lives with technology isn't enough. Now he wants to revolutionize snack time too. And me? Well, I learned a few things from this whole ordeal. First, never underestimate the power of a pissed-off dad with too much time on his hands. Second, always read your HOA handbook, because you never know what kind of nonsense might be hiding in there. And third, sometimes revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about making things better for everyone. Now, before I wrap this up, let me leave you with one final story. A little cherry on top of this revenge sundae. A few weeks after Linda left, Greg decided to hold a neighborhood block party to celebrate our newfound freedom from tyranny. Everyone showed up. Kids, parents, even Mr. Thompson with his beloved sunflowers, which were now proudly displayed in his front yard. There were burgers on the grill, music playing in the background. It was everything you'd want from a suburban block party. But the highlight of the night? That would be when Greg unveiled his surprise. A giant inflatable flamingo lawn ornament that he'd rented for the occasion. It stood right in the middle of the cul-de-sac like a big pink middle finger to Linda and all her ridiculous rules. People laughed so hard they cried, and then they took selfies with it because apparently that's what we do now. So yeah, justice was served. Suburbia was restored, and life went on better than before. Now, if you've made it this far into my story and you're still listening or reading or whatever you're doing right now, thank you. Seriously, Thank you for sticking around through all my ranting and raving about mailboxes and medical bags and beige paint. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, or if you just love a good revenge story, do me a favor. Like this video, or post or podcast or whatever this is. Share it with your friends who hate HOAs as much as I do. Leave a comment about your own suburban horror stories, because I know you've got them. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of suburban chaos and triumph. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that sometimes life gives you lemons, and sometimes it gives you flamingos.